religious education through the Orthodox Christian Network. This is also a ministry of the Greek Orthodox Church of St. George. And as usual, I've been saying this every week lately. Apologize, we're running late. We do advertise this to start at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, but just have a lot going on in our church here. All good problems, so to speak, but all good things, I shouldn't say. They're not really problems, but just causing us to start late. So we'll have an abbreviated discussion today. For those of you who may be joining for the first time ever, this format is I'm in a room with others. We have a dialogue about a topic, and we invite comments for those of you online that may be joining. You can type your comments in. I see them, sometimes not always timely, but I do try to respond. So the theme this year has been Icons, Christ, and Life. We're coming at our faith and our life from the idea of what it means to live iconographically, what it means to understand that. And in that vein, we've been talking the last few weeks really about hypocrisy and how that relates to distorting the image and likeness, the icon that we are, being icons of Christ. So today, or last week, we really had a nice discussion about hypocrisy versus weakness, and we're going to continue on that thread. But we're actually going to get into, for the time we have, we're going to get into the things Christ said about hypocrisy, who he said it to, and discuss why. As I said last week, for those of you that may have joined, no one spoke more about hypocrisy in the scriptures than Christ himself, by far. And there's something fundamentally so deep and important for us to understand about the nature of hypocrisy, how easy it is to either slip into it or go in that direction, and then what it does to us. Because the way this really relates to the theme of icon is there's a fine line between icons and idols, and we can take anything that we should be revering, venerating in life, icons themselves, but other things that are iconic, if you will, and we can turn them into idols. And when we do this, it's the way hypocrisy relates to this is that icon image that's in us, it destroys that or distorts it significantly. So I'm going to start with a quote that I read because we've been talking a lot about veils and masks, and I just want to set up with this quote and get right into it. So the quote is by an abbot of a monastery in Orthodox. His name is Archimandrite Ephraim, and he says, "The theology of the person, as this is revealed in the Hesychist ascetic tradition, stillness and silence, is the most significant counter-argument to the postmodern individualism and relativism. The aesthetics of introversion and conscious tranquility, hesychia, is not a psychological proposition, but the authentic and only way of transforming the repulsive mask into a person." So remember, we talked last week about masks, how that relates to the word hypocrisy. So I thought that quote was interesting because I think a lot of what we're doing, we talked about veils and masks the last few weeks, is becoming more self-aware sometimes of the masks we're wearing or beginning to wear. So let's get into the discussion about what Christ said. And I'm going to quote Luke 12, verse 1 to start this off. He said, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy." Okay, remember that quote?
Beware the leaven?
The leaven. Remember with leaven, he said, a little bit of leaven works its way through the whole bread. So if it's bad leaven, he always spoke in symbols and metaphors a lot. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. So does anybody remember? Let's begin a discussion. So he said that in a particular setting. But does anybody remember where he spoke about hypocrisy the most? Like what were the circumstances? Who was his audience? What part of the gospel was he saying this?
The Pharisees and the Sadducees all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess it depends upon which gospel. I did a little of my own sort of surveys.
Sure.
Probably in the case I'm retired, have too much time on my hands. But going through the New Testament to see, and they Googled it.
Right.
And Book of Matthew actually has most incidents of, quote, hypocrisy, which is not disturbing, but I mean, to Matthew specifically, if you read that, he is by far of the Gospels the one who wants the most to adhere to Jewish law.
Mm-hmm.
And his view of hypocrisy and Pharisees committing, shall we say, a sin, whatever, is the fact that in the end, they were not obeying Jewish law. And that what Jesus was doing was restoring back the proper law.
Right.
Okay. So that, even though, I mean, there are some universal applications, I think, to the things he's saying about hypocrisy. And certainly that gospel ends with him saying, go out to the Gentiles.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very specific thing in the book of Matthew in terms of Pharisees committing things that are not misunderstanding or certainly not obeying Jewish law. And I was also, not to go off on a tangent, I was concerned last week you were using the term demonic an awful lot. And I sort of looked that up in an Orthodox sort of dictionary and on various websites.
Mhm.
And it really was the correct term. And I think it very much applies to things like the Pharisees, because not only does demonic or the devil in Orthodoxy mean absences God, it's also in terms of people who basically should know better and knowingly offend God. And I think that applies to the Pharisees a lot.
Yeah, and I think there's a reason why Matthew uses it the most. I mean, to what you said, and it goes to what Maria said. Who was he using the word hypocrite or hypocrisy the most to? Was to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the religious establishment, right? Luke was writing more for a Gentile audience,
Right.
and so. But I think to me at least, it's subject to discussion. I think that's a warning to us all who practice our faith, practice our religion, right? To how easy it is to be given, because as Orthodox Christians, we understand the giving of the law. Most of the appearances of God in the Old Testament were theophanies of Christ, right? So, Christ said, "I didn't come to abolish the law; I came to fulfill it." So the law was not being followed properly. It was being followed to the letter, but not to the spirit. Hypocrisy. So that's why you find it in Matthew the most. So, but in the beginning, look at the Gospel of Matthew. But you're correct. That's where it is. Most of the first encounter with a lot of the word hypocrite is in the Sermon on the Mount, where he's saying, he's essentially, in some respects, reestablishing the essence of the law, the purpose of it, what it's supposed to lead you to.
There's one place in the Bible where he actually displayed anger for the first time, and that was with the money changers
Mhm.
front. So that was hypocrisy right there.
Well, yeah,
They're doing
it was huge hypocrisy because it was. I think we've talked about it in here before. What the religious establishment was doing was poaching the land from the people. The temple was turned into, and so the temple is, the temple, just like the temple is iconic in nature, what it's supposed to represent. Because God can work however he wants, but he chooses to work through material things to minister to us through the sanctuaries, the temples, bread and wine, whatever. So it was such a denigration of something so sacred they were doing. So that's why he was angry. But he also, the other thing is interesting, and if you look, for those of you that did read or remember this, do you remember some of the language he used when he was calling them people hypocrites? How he referred to them as? Brood of vipers.
Mhm.
Said all kinds of tough things, right?
Mhm.
And so I think sometimes, again, subject for discussion, I think sometimes our perception of Christ's love is a little too soft in terms of what love really demands. Okay, because if you read the Gospels carefully, or maybe not carefully, it's pretty obvious he spent a lot of time with these people, reasoning with them. He didn't just cuss them out and walk away. So he's telling them these harsh things, not to just insult them and move on. It's to wake them up, to be part of their transformation, and they never did. And that's why from the back in the Old Testament, we see what we see in the New Testament is just a continued manifestation, or a version of this rebellion that's kept on going. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I think it was the Lord of Spirits. I think it was. It might have been. Anyway, Father Stephen DeYoung said it, whether it was his own podcast or that, but he was reminding people of. You remember in the book of Numbers when they raised the pole, the serpent, that the vipers, the snakes were biting the Israelites, and God instructed Moses make the pole. Well, and Christ basically said, when I'm lifted up on the cross and draw people to him, he pointed back to that incident in Numbers. Later on in the Bible, and I forget where the priest said it was, but it became clear they took that pole, which was an icon in that respect, and they had turned it into something of an idol, like the pole had a property in and of itself, right? So, we see all these behaviors that they're in the Old Testament, they're in the New Testament, and we can extrapolate, and we can probably point to examples in our own lives where we've seen similar things, even though some of these things may seem so remote. But it's things that we can do too. I mean, we've talked many times in here. Sometimes we can even make the tradition of our faith an idol, because we're losing sight of Christ himself. And it becomes all about how well I fast, or how well I pray, or how well I go to church, and all these things. And before you know it, you're feeling a little bit of self-congratulatory about your sacramental behavior, and we're all losing sight of what it's supposed to be doing to us. I mean, I think we've all been there at some point, but go ahead.
Well, there's a specific reference, and you'll forgive me. I don't know. I forget which exact gospel writer it was, but the classic blatant example of hypocrisy was the Pharisee. Was it a Pharisee who was bragging about how he tithed and he adhered to all of the requirements of the Sabbath and fasting and the like? And then there was the tax collector, right? Who hid his face in shame. And Christ says to his audience, who's the godly person here, right?
The publican and the Pharisee. And that's why he's probably so hard on, because again, extrapolating back, Adam and Eve's task was to descend from the mountaintop where Eden was and bring paradise to the rest of the world. There was failure in that. He establishes his own nation, the nation of Israel, to essentially do that task. There's failure in that, right? He establishes the church to do this. There's failure in that. So he's always holding any of us who are choosing to embrace the faith, to do that. And so that's why he said, that's why he said in other parts, make sure you count the cost before you follow me, because you may not be able to do it. In that case, you have to wait till you're able to, because the danger to us as individuals, so we get overly enthusiastic and think that we're more spiritually advanced than we are, or whatever. There's that more danger of falling away or falling into hypocrisy, as opposed to being humble and really approaching things with the care and concern we should. And to the religious people, again, anything, get into this a little bit too, is I had in my notes, but anything in life that gives you power gives you danger. Right? Whether it's power in your own home, power in your workplace, power in your government. Human beings in general have been shown to wield power not well. Right? That's why we have so many wars. That's why we have so much oppression. We have all kinds of things, because power is a dangerous thing. And hypocrisy and power can go together, I think. I don't know. Let me throw that out for you guys. Agree, disagree, challenge. I mean,
maybe it's a fine line. It's tough.
What's a fine line?
Power, power, but not always.
No, not always. I mean, there's certainly been very good leaders, very good people that have, No, and I'm not trying to paint everything. Like when I say these things, I'm not saying it's universal. If you're powerful, you're always going to be evil. I'm just saying these, just like, Paul said, the love of money, not money itself. There's just certain things in life, certain things, Christ grouped under mammon that can take us, if we're not careful, can take us down a road. Right, Andrea?
I was just going to say, when you said there are very good leaders, I'm sure those leaders with power, though, listen to their very good advisors. So I'm sure that very smart people who are trying to do good, but in those powerful positions, what I would say is you surround yourself with advisors who are also good people that allow you to self-reflect and think about what you're doing so that you can continue on that positive path. Because it can, when you get angry or when something doesn't go your way, it's easy to stray. But when you have your support system that can talk you through things, you can stay on the narrow. So I would say those good leaders have their support system no matter what they are in a place like that.
Yeah, and you weren't here when I read this quote about the postmodern individualism and relativism. I mean, one of the things is, I have it later in the notes if we get to it, the danger of that. In Orthodoxy, we always emphasize there's that the importance of the person, the importance of the individual, but also in the context of the community, never divorced from it. And when we don't submit ourselves to accountability, or we don't exist in the communal way, right? Like you're saying, as parish council president, I'm sure your experience is now, right? Because going it alone is not good. You have to have the people around you, right? I sat in that position too. It was debilitating without people around. So yeah, and that's a lot of times what Christ attacked too. He attacked the people in the power because of what they were doing. It wasn't that he was condemning them. He was saying their behavior was condemning themselves, not trying to condemn them. He wasn't trying to condemn them for the sake of condemning them. It was for restoration. Anyway, someone's going to say something, John.
Without taking this in a different direction,
It's okay if we do.
he's not only condemning for actions, right? Because isn't it that one passage where he condemns, was it the Pharisees or a certain audience for their thoughts? When he is it the lame person with the pallet,
Mhm.
and they're thinking, who is this man to forgive
Mhm.
sins? If I remember the passage correctly, they never actually say anything, and Christ knows what they're thinking and says,
Sorry, guys.
and condemns them for their thoughts. Now, I don't know where that takes us in terms of hypocrisy, because we tend to associate hypocrisy with our deeds, right?
I think it relates.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't want to go down a wormhole, but I'm just saying, I'm wondering if there's a connection there as well, because Christ condemns us for thoughts that are not proper either, obviously.
I think I can connect the dots, or try, and you guys can tell me if you disagree. So there's plenty of places in the gospel where, again, if you read it closely, it's easy to miss if you're reading it quickly, where Christ clearly knows all the thoughts of people he's dealing with before they speak. There's many instances where people don't speak and he says something. He clearly knows their thoughts. And he also gives us a warning, especially when he talks about adultery, right? He said to look at somebody with lust.
Mm-hmm.
And adultery is a great metaphor,
Right.
because throughout the Old Testament, the rebellion of the Israelites is cast in terms of adultery. And we'll get into this year, because marriage, the sacrament of marriage, of union, is so much deeper than even what we think of as marriage. So the opposite of that is why it's always used as a metaphor for almost the worst sin, is the rebellion against God. It's adultery. So Jesus picks that example to show that these things begin in our thoughts before they manifest in action. So he is both, he's all encompassing, obviously. He's instructing us about our thought. He's instructing us about our action. Go ahead.
I'm looking forward to when we begin those classes, because I always wondered in at least one of the passages when Christ is, I guess, angry at the disciples, maybe, you of a sinful and adulterous
Generation.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I always wondered, where did the adulterous come in here, because it's not the general context that we would associate with adultery. So we'll look forward to that class also.
It's all about rebellion, mainly. Yeah, and he says, if you who are evil know how to give good things to your children, So he doesn't mince,
No.
he doesn't, no.
Mhm.
So let's examine at least a few of the passages where he spoke about hypocrisy, and let's just talk about how can we apply them to our lives. I'll just start with the Sermon on the Mount. And some of these are fairly obvious. He says, therefore, when you do a charitable deed, don't sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. Does anybody find that a challenge at all? I'm not saying you guys give and like announce it with trumpets, but does anybody find that aspect of life challenging when you do good?
Oh, sure. I mean,
Yeah.
you gotta be recognized
Right.
for it, right?
Yeah.
In a sense, you want to, you want others to pat you on the back, but you also want to.
I know I'm gonna irritate people, but I'm gonna say I've probably been guilty of what I'm about to say too. But I'm just gonna say it. I see it in social media all the time. I'm honored to be this, or I'm honored to be that. We're really just saying, look at what I've done. And no, I don't think anything is. It's not evil to do that. I mean, we all want. There's a difference. There's a fine line between validation and adulation, right? And we need validation from others. We don't do work. We don't do things just to have complete anonymity. We literally feed off the love and the validation that come from others. I'm just saying that with everything that's good, it runs the risk of us turning it into something that's not so good. Okay, and I'm saying that's Christ is clearly pointing out at some point people start losing their way with things like that, and they start doing it for recognition. And I think that's a universal application. He's attacking a particular group here, but it's a universal application. So so anything I say, I'm not trying to be extreme. So just recognize I'm not saying it. I'm pointing out. Father Thomas Hopko once said, orthodoxy is paradoxy. We have to look at all things. Okay.
Well, that happens to me sometimes when I'm trying to set a good example for my sons.
Mhm.
So you try to commit an act of kindness, but you're committing the act of kindness for its own sake. And then I struggle with myself saying, okay, do I tell my children in this example, I did this so that they take it as a learning lesson? Or am I telling them this, they say, what a great dad we have? And that's sometimes where that internal struggle arises.
Yeah. No. But I would say the struggle is good. I mean, I think sometimes when there's absence of struggle, that's something for us to look at. Because there should be that tension in most of what we do. That's why Christ, we think of Christ, rightfully so, the Prince of Peace, but he also said things like, I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring war. Because it starts with an internal battle, and most of us don't fight an external one, but there's reasons why, and it's good to have that kind of dynamic tension within ourselves, to always ask ourselves, what are our motivations? Because God knows them. He knows what we're thinking before we even think it. So it really helps us if we know our own.
The human element will always disappoint. I mean, we see that.
Mhm.
Power corrupts in that respect. People get too full of themselves. But to your point, John, I think with kids, the way I try to do it, not more actions than even talking. And I hope that would always serve well for my kids rather than talking much. But yeah, it's always going to be a struggle. It's always going to be the balance that by inviting them what works.
Well, sometimes you have to say to them too, because I've said this, and I hope it's okay. I've done something, and I said, listen, I'm going to point out what I've done because I want you to know why I've done it, or at least what I'm telling myself. And so you can't always expect somebody to connect the dots without telling them. I mean, sometimes we're guilty of that when we talk about liturgy. Some real purists think all you need is liturgy. You're going to get everything out of liturgy. You're going to learn everything in liturgy, and even if it's not in a language you understand, it'll open your heart. You'll know, and that's just not true. Right? There's teaching ministries. There's a liturgy. There's all kinds of things that all help us grow in understanding. And certainly we have to tell people things explicitly and be told ourselves in order to understand that.
And everybody learns differently.
Right.
So some people might learn through actions. Some people might have to be told, exactly. It has to be spelled out.
Mm-hmm.
Some people use their own imagination at work. So everybody learns differently. And I think that's where Christ was coming into play, because it was thoughts, it was actions, it's everything.
Yeah, everything, and he spoke to everybody about it. So that's why I said you can't just necessarily paint everything with one brush. It's everything has universal application that he said and did, but it's also there's things very specific to the time and the audience, and we have to. That's why we have frankly, that's why we have the scriptures themselves were understood liturgically, and that's why we're so within the Orthodox Church. We look at the scriptures as understood through the holy tradition held in the consciences of the church. Not that we don't individually read them, but it's part of just interpreting them on our own is where danger happens, right? Because there's language and there's culture and there's context and there's so much stuff, and you also have to be able to realize when you're wrong, which we learn more and more. So I'm gonna
say it's like the Ethiopian man, right? Which gospel is that, Michael?
Oh, that's
Ethiopian man who says
Acts 8.
I need for you to help me understand.
Yeah, that's Acts 8, 26 through 39. I just know that because that's a frequent reading in the Orthodox Church. So Christ has several times where he says the same thing about he talks about when you pray basically privately, don't be seen. Or my favorite when he says when you're fasting, don't sit on the street corner disfiguring your face so everybody knows you're fasting. So there's a lot he says that you can bring under the heading of public display for the sake of public display. He certainly wants let your good deeds shine before men. So he's not saying public display is a bad thing. He's saying that your motivations for it is what that's why he says hypocrite, because you're only doing it because you want to be seen. You want adulation. You're not seeking to help someone in their own veneration, their own worship. You're seeking your own adulation.
What's in it for me?
Yeah, and again, I think that you can take it to an extreme and say, almost go too far the other way, because again, why we share things because we want the validation and we need the validation, right? I mean, I wouldn't be sitting in this room doing this if there was not some validation coming back that this was useful for everybody, or all of us. There's no point, right? Otherwise, it'd just be self-indulgent, things like that. So everybody needs validation. It's just, it's just slipping too far. And here again, he says about judging others. He says, hypocrite, take the plank out of your own eye before you take the speck of sawdust. That to me, I think that's probably one of the biggest areas of hypocrisy that we as human beings can fall into. Agree, disagree, judging others? I think in one particular area, it's always dangerous. And I know I'm not 90% of what I'm about to say, 90% of 1% of the time when I think I know this, I'm wrong. People's motives. We see their behavior or whatever, we think we know their motives. Agree, disagree? It's like there's such Christ say, get that plank out of your own eye before you can see clearly somebody else's. And I think taking the plank out of our own eye, if we're honest, that's hard.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Do you agree? Or do you guys all, some of you in here think you're so sage that you know people's motives all the time?
Well, no.
Yeah.
Obviously, it depends on the circumstance.
It does.
Because, Jesus also did not want us to be fooled by sort of these false prophets or anything like that. So, Christ knew our God knows our motivations, our inner thoughts. I won't pretend that I do or individuals do, but at the same time, I think he's also urging us to sometimes be very cautious of people's motives and bad motives. And that's the whole point of some of these stories. Back again, not to keep harping on the same thing about the Pharisees, but that's sort of the whole point of those stories to me. Is again, don't take it from people who are sort of doing the wrong thing. That makes sense.
Michael,
it does.
It's what I also find interesting. I never thought about it until now, and that's the comparison. Christ doesn't say take the speck out of your own eye before you take the speck out of the other one's eye. It's a plank.
Mhm.
It's colossal
Yeah.
compared to the speck. Like, you have so many problems of your own to fix. Leave the others' problems alone and take care of this massive problem you have before you worry about this little problem that's annoying you, or that's causing you to judge or condemn someone.
Right. And
I never thought about
I
that.
think
The
you used the
plank
right
is-
term, judgment too,
Yeah.
because it's sort of not up to us to
Mhm.
judge people. You know, you cast the first stone.
Mhm.
We shouldn't be doing that. God should be doing that.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, John. I was just going to go there too, because the problem is we all start playing God with each other. We start playing God with ourselves. We judge our own selves too severely, right? We don't allow God because we're already, and again, that sounds, sometimes that self-deprecation sounds like a good thing, but in many ways it's not, because you're playing God in your own head and you're blocking him out. You may be right. You may say, oh my gosh, I behaved horrible on this, on that, woe to me. Okay, fine. But you have to move on from that and allow God to do his work. That's where the humility comes in, where it doesn't become, oh, I'm so awful. It becomes, yeah, I'm pretty bad. But it's a different relationship.
There's a pop reference to this now of the last 5-6 years, and the individual will go nameless. It's not a theological, contribution, but for especially a lot of young people who think that they're going to fix the world, the admonition is clean your own room first, then go and save the world. Most people don't bother with their own sort of immediate world. They're busy solving everyone else's problems when they have so many problems of their own. So it's a very easy way to sort of incorporate Christ's
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
really caught on, because I've been following some of this, because I'm
Yeah.
kind of following the sacramental theological trajectory of this, and I'm
Yeah.
seeing things, and I don't take this the wrong way. I see things, and I'm like, okay, this seems to be progressing. I'm waiting for the breakthrough, because but the language being used is resonating with people. It speaks to them. That clean your. It's like, oh, I get that. So it's wonderful, but it's not a new principle, right? It's embedded in our faith, actually.
And most of our rooms are still
Pretty messy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We're
and that's
out
what
there
it's
saving the world.
right. So we're
Yeah.
tying this all together. We spend time analyzing the motives of others, thinking we get them. We're not dealing with the plank in our own eye. And then I would say, relating this to hypocrisy, I would say hypocrisy in its fullest form, or even parts of it, is diametrically opposed to love. Because love is always about the actions that are meant to serve others well. Christ, love your brother, lay down your life for your brother, all those kind of things that are really, in essence, about serving others well before yourself. But paradoxically, when you do that, you're actually serving yourself because you're in union with Christ. And hypocrisy takes that lens and is bringing it this way, because then you start looking wrong this way, and then you start reflecting false that way. And you become concerned about yourself all the time and your image and how you're being perceived and all this stuff. And that plank is starting to get bigger. So I think it's someone's outside the door. I don't know who they're looking for. So I think it's a bigger problem.
Are there any pledge forms in here?
No.
No. Okay. Sorry, everybody. We're not everybody knows we're conducting a discussion in here. So, but if you have any pledge forms, please send them to us. So, yeah. So again, we're getting near the end. We didn't really get too far in terms of all the things he said, but just when I look at collectively where Christ attacked hypocrisy, it was for these things, right? It was for public display, power and control, behavior. I mean, the other place he really brought it up, and I think, John, you alluded to it earlier, in the Gospel of Matthew, it's towards the back. One of his final discourses before the events of the crucifixion take place. It's pretty dark. If you read Matthew 23 and Matthew 24, it's really about the end of the world as we think of it, and castigation of the religious establishment. I see.
What specifically?
Yeah, sure.
I don't know Matthew 23 and 24.
Okay.
Off the top of my head.
I'll just read you a couple of things. But a couple of things. What he says. He says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. and you neither go in yourselves or you do not allow any who are entering to go in. So basically, he's basically saying you're not good. You're keeping people out. You're not teacher. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! You devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. Therefore, you will receive greater condemnation. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, not to interrupt,
Yeah, please.
there's an evolution in Matthew. Like you said before, tries and tries and tries sort of to get the Jewish religious establishment at the time to restore the law, and finally it's just gets to the point where it just can't be anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, although some scholars, I think there's more of an evolution in Luke, some scholars say that Matthew, or the book of Matthew, isn't really trying to create a new religion, but a different sect, or restore a more pure form of Judaism. But that's why at the very end we have Jesus, not in Jerusalem, but in Galilee, going to the apostles and saying, go after the Gentiles.
Yep. What scholars when you're referring to any particular threads?
Martin, Yale, one, just in general.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm certainly not a biblical scholar, or do I play one on TV or anything like that, but I almost have that sense too, that there's a point in the Gospel of Matthew where he's just, since it is, again, not to get fixated, since it is very, very strict on Jewish law, it's the most sort of Jewish of the Gospels. I kind of wonder whether, certainly wanted to create a new religion of sorts, but whether it's Christianity or whether it's just a righteous sort of restoration of Judaism. That's the sense I got. Now you have a different evolution in Luke.
Well,
Anyway,
they all tie together, and it's just like it's like if you read biographies about someone, they all choose different things to write about, but it's still that same someone. So it just that's as the scriptures, the scriptures were essentially formed by what the churches were choosing to read. So and so there was a natural attrition of dumb stuff that got dumped out, right? And so these four gospels paint this the complete picture that God has chosen to give us to understand. I would say it was supposed to be a fulfillment, not a different religion. I mean, Christ said, the new covenant I've come to fulfill. And Christianity was known as the way at first. It was just the way. It was, it's all about restoration. If you look, Christ he was making things new, but that newness was in the restoring of how things should have been. Right? That's mainly what it was.
He's also the Messiah,
Right.
who's arrived finally, that the Jewish people have been waiting for several
Right.
thousand years, and he arrived. That's the heart of all of this, right?
Yeah.
Again, there's this, not to get fixated, this dilemma as to who it's supposed to apply to. Is it just supposed to be a sort of Jewish Messiah, or is it what it became a universal Messiah?
Well, again, because God always chooses to work through us. So he chose to work through a small group of people with the idea that it would spread to the world. That's what he's doing today. So, we say now Christ is ruling amidst his enemies. And I think if we step back, we can make a case for that, because with all the garbage going on in the world today, if you look at it, there's much more good than there was before Christ. Right.
Mhm.
And there's still I've said this before, and we're going to get into this too this year, God willing, this whole tension between living in the now and the not yet. That's why tension's good, because we're living, and we see that in Christ's body himself, right? When he's in the resurrected Christ, still retained his old wounds. So there was a fulfillment of the brokenness in the newness, right? So all the stuff we go through now, the trials and tribulations, all the things that break us and hurt us, that's all going to be part of something new and better we can't even imagine, that serves us now, though we just don't quite get it. So Christ, this, it was meant to be universal. It's just through a small group. And that's why you see, we have all these symbols of smallness, the mustard seed, which actually needs to be bruised before it grows. Pope St. Gregory or St. Gregory the Great, as a Holy Father talked about, it needs to be bruised before it grows. We always see this whole metaphor of something small becoming something big, right? And so that's our whole faith. So it's definitely. You have your hand up?
No.
Oh, okay. I just thought I saw a hand. You might just be telling me, okay, you talked enough. My wife to my right. That's why I said that. So we're a little past time. So I'm going to just ask you a question before we go. I feel like we've maybe exhausted this topic of hypocrisy pretty much. Time to
In a good way.
yeah, in a good way.
Yeah.
I'm saying, because I mean, we didn't cover everything, but that's okay, because I think we're ready to start going in a different direction next week, a different series. So the last thing I'll say, again, I do want to make this point about it, because we didn't really talk about it, but remember in the Garden of Eden, spiritual death came first. Physical death is a result of spiritual death.
Mhm.
Okay, hypocrisy can what lead us to spiritual death. That's why Christ talked so much in condemning tones, because he wanted I desire that all shall be saved, right? But not everybody's going to make that choice. So this is why he uses harsh language and really, comes at people hard to wake them up. Now, we shouldn't necessarily take license that we need to come at people hard, because we're not that skillful at it. But the point being, one of the last things I'll say is it's important that we do to the best of our ability. And to Andrea's point, we need people to hold us accountable. We need to be as truthful as possible at all times. Anybody in business knows you're dealing with passive aggressive stuff all the time, because people don't tell you the truth, right? And then you don't know where you are half the time, where you stand. So Christ is the truth. So the message about hypocrisy is all of us need to be as truthful as possible while being as loving as possible, recognizing that we're going to fail at it, but that's why we have Christ and each other to hold us accountable, so that we do not become hypocrites that wear masks. So that'll end that. We're going to go in a different direction. I have a couple of things planned. I'm not sure. I'll pray about it and see where we go starting next week for another series of lessons. But God bless everyone. Have a wonderful week. Hopefully we'll start closer on time next week, but who knows? But God bless everyone. Take care.